All right, we're recording, and I'm on with Shane Miller. Um, so Shane, this is your first time on the podcast. You're a part of the Slack group. You sent me an amazing piece to read,
Thank
which
you.
it's one of those things that was so good I was angry at it at first. I was like, son of a, yeah, it was really good.
Thank
But
you.
first, let's get to know you before we jump into your piece. Let's get to know you a little bit. Talk to me about where you are in your writing journey.
Sure. So I am about as fresh as you can get. I haven't published anything yet,
That
but
makes me,
I
this is
have.
so good, it makes me madder. Okay, keep going.
I write urban fantasy, new adult mainly,
Nice.
but I do have a few ideas for some young adult fantasy going forward, which will be unconnected to the piece that I sent you.
Okay.
And that's pretty much me at the moment.
Nice. How far along? So the piece we're looking at is called The Witch's Revenge, and it's chapter 3 of a book.
Yep.
How far along is this book?
It's self-edited at the moment.
So you got a full draft, self-edited.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's right.
What are you doing to edit?
What am I using? So
what's your process?
I don't know if you've ever read it, but I read Chris Spizek's book, the novel editing workbook.
No, I've never read it. Is it good?
It's so good. You need to read that.
I'll
Put that on your TBR straight away. It's great.
Yeah.
And then for copy edits, just pro writing aid at the moment.
Okay. Does the novel editing workbook give you like a process?
Yeah, so it's I think it's 101 tips and tricks.
Wow. Okay.
And it takes you through the whole process from kind of structural developmental editing right down to line edits and copy editing.
Nice. Awesome. Very cool. Okay, so let's so we got a first draft that's in the process of being edited. I'm going to share my screen so we can talk about the specific piece and get into the edits themselves. So first I want to talk about what you're doing that I really, really love. And why I read the piece and got angry, because it was like, son of a gun. And I just want to say, so because you're an opening writer, and I know there's a lot of new writers that listen to this, there's this weird dream with new writers that like, oh, I'm gonna send this piece to an editor and there's gonna be no marks on it. I loved this, and I marked like every third or fourth line. And
well, to be fair, I was expecting a lot more marks. So
well, good.
I'm happy with this.
Yeah. So, but just this like relationship with writer and editor, just to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, sure.
And this is less for you, Shane, and more for everybody else. So if an editor, like, well, I can't speak for all editors, but I know for Laura and I, we love to like help create beautiful things. And by beautiful, I don't mean like, you know, ethereal. I mean like something that you look at and you're like, man, that's great. And so there's a deep, when somebody sends you something that's really good, there's a deep excitement. There's like, oh my gosh. So once I got over my anger of like, this is so good for a first time writer, I'm mad at it. And then I was like, then I got over that. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so fun. So because edits just become like fun playtime and less like, oh, we've got this structural stuff to fix. So yeah, that's more for just people in the podcast. Like, hey, here's a trick about if you get something back from your editor and they've just cut the crap out of it, it likely means that they were enjoying the read.
And that's what you paid them for, right? So
yeah,
I'd be annoyed if they didn't.
That's true. But see, I say that, but I have, especially when Laura first started editing my work, she'd send me stuff back, and my initial response was like, oh, I thought I'd get a clean page, at least one clean page. Still clean pages. Okay, so let's talk about what I love you're doing. This is a conversation between three characters. You've got Jez, the cab driver, and Henry. And they're in a cab together. So we've got kind of a big cast scene, which is 3 to 5 characters.
Yeah.
So, and that kind of shifts the dialogue rules that we're going to use. And we've got what is kind of like a box, like a closed box scene, right? Like they're in this contained space. So there's not, I love it because it forces body language. and like contained body language, right? Like I feel like a lot of times as writers, we use action as a crutch to like keep the energy moving. And what's great about these closed box scenes is that like your dialogue has to be spot on and you keep it moving. It's great.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, but that's kind of, and they're setting up, Jazz is kind of talking just to set up the piece. Jazz is trying to pull some information out of Henry, and Henry is not sharing. And it's told from Henry's perspective.
Yeah.
First person POV, Henry. So you can already see, the reason I'm scrolling here is because you can already see that something just, one of the first things I do when I edit a piece is I just look at the physicality of it. I'm like, okay, how are the paragraphs spaced out? Where is this? Can I tell that people are talking? And a lot of times, like if somebody's going to have a problem with like too much description, what I'm going to see is big paragraphs, like one big paragraph after another. And then it's like, okay, we're gonna have to take some, I know immediately, like my job as the editor is going to be to rip some of this up and try to put it into dialogue. Scanning yours just with the eye, you can see that like, okay, we've got some solid conversations in here. There's good pacing of like some quick back and forths that build up that emotional energy and emotional tone, spaced out with these kind of like moments of reflection. And you can just, I can see that just by scanning it with my eye, which tells me, like, preps me as an editor, like, okay, how much work am I going to have to do here? What's the focus of my work? So I recommend, I do this when I edit my own work too. So when I'm editing my own stuff, before I ever like jump into the edits, I just scan it like that to be like, okay, what am I seeing? And what do I need to prepare myself for? And you can kind of get like the weight of the piece by doing that. Like, oh, this is going to be like a lot of work for the reader, or this is going to really move. So the first thing I love that you're doing is the structure of the piece is really great. I can tell just by looking at it, there's going to be a lot of energy. The next thing you do is the conversation is primarily between Jazz and Henry. I'm getting his name right, aren't I? It is.
Yes,
Henry.
You are. Yeah.
It's not mentioned till the end, so I was about to scroll down and
No,
find
it's
it.
not.
It's Henry, right? So Jazz and Henry. And what's nice here is that you've got two different voices.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe Jazz and Henry's voice?
So obviously the whole point of the scene is that Jez is trying to extract information from Henry, and he, to give context, they've known each other since they were like 5, I guess. I mean, I don't know the entire backstory, but I'd say 5-ish. They've been friends forever.
Yeah.
So Jez is not the sort of person that's going to back down when he wants to know something.
Yeah.
So he will push and push and push because he cares deeply about his friends.
Nice.
Whereas Henry he has a wound in his past, which will play a pivotal role in the book. He is essentially a failed martial artist, which I know doesn't come across in this scene, but he suffered trauma, which has led to him not wanting to fight, not wanting to engage in conflict. So the whole point of his character arc is to travel from kind of cowardice to courage by the end of the novel.
Okay. So what I love that you're doing with these two characters is, like, in dialogue doctor language, we talk about taking those personalities you just described. Jez, somebody who compassionately cares about his friends and isn't afraid to like dig in. And also I would add to that, at least from reading this scene, has a little bit of an edge, right? Like Jez is quick to like jump on you.
Yeah.
And then Henry, who's got this past trauma and who has a little bit of like guardedness and covering up, right? So we've got these two great personalities, and the question is like, how do we get them to sound different? So when we talk about like words being the language they use and the topics they cover, you've got you've done a great job of translating Jez's personality into his words. So he asks a lot of questions, right? Yeah. What's up with you? And then he pushes in a lot, doesn't look like nothing, right? So we're just reading Jez's words in this short exchange here. What's up with you? Doesn't look like nothing. How long have we been friends? Yeah, so I know when something's wrong. I call bullshit, right? Like the words you're choosing, sure, like the questions, the like challenging topics, the not afraid to dig in is totally an expression of his personality, which is really, really great. You'll notice his pacing. So we talk about words, which is language and topics. We talk about body language, which we'll get to in a minute. We talk about because I want more body language from Jez and less from Henry. We talk about cadence and we talk about pacing. So Jez's pacing is great too, because he starts every conversation, right? Jez like is the aggressor in the conversation. Jez is driving the topic. He's not going to be like put off or pushed around. Jez is like diving into the topic. So his pacing is that like take charge of the conversation, lead the conversation, and often like make a final declaration in the conversation. Very strong personality and very caring, because it's driven toward him, right? Like if Jez's topics were all about himself, we'd be like, man, Jez is a jerk. But because he's focused on like digging this thing out of Henry, we get this like, man, Jez is a really aggressive friend. So that's the voice you set up for Jez in this piece, which is great. The question is, can you maintain it across the whole book, which is hard. The voice you've set up for Henry in this piece is this. So let's read his lines. Nothing. I'm fine. Forever. Nothing's wrong. Call whatever you like. Right? So like it's that pushing off, right? His words, we're getting short declarations. There's no questions. There's no, and then his cadence, which is like the structure of the sentences, right? All through this piece, 1 to 2 words, short, quick sentences, right? And so, and responsive, right? Like his pacing is responsive to the person he's talking to. So already, if we're going to put these on a chart, right, you can see that we've got 2 very different voices, which creates this really that's part of what's making your piece so great, is I read it and I'm like, yeah, I can picture these 2 people talking. They sound differently to me. I don't need dialogue tags here, which is awesome, because now we can use dialogue tags strategically, right? Like if we can get to a place where we don't need them, we can get strategic with them, which is great. So really nice job with the voices.
Thank you.
Yeah, really well done. And so we've got that that sharp back and forth. We talk about another nice thing you've done here that I'm gonna claim for you was intentional. So don't correct me if it wasn't. We want characters that are allies, right? Like these 2 characters that are like allies. And when I say allies, I'm talking about like in the plot, right? They're friends. They're in this together. We want them to complement each other in some ways and contrast each other in some ways to create these really great conversations. Their voices complement and contrast each other. And so part of the reason we want them to complement each other is because we have to feel like these 2 people enjoy talking to one another. They're close enough in voice that conversation comes easily, right? That it's not this strain and this struggle, which the cab driver is not a friend and not an ally. She's a side character. Does she come back in the book, or is this the one time you see her?
No, I kind of want to bring her back now based on your notes, though, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah,
later.
We'll get to that. So she's a side character. She's not a major driver in the plot. We don't want her to complement with them. We want her to be explosive, right? Like she's going to be a catalyst. So we'll get to her in a minute. But part of what you've done with these 2 characters is by complementing their cadence, short 1 sentences at a time, right? Bursts of language. You can feel like, yeah, these 2 would talk to each other. Like they would, this is an easy flowing conversation. These 2 are friends. At the same time, you contrasted their voices, so it's interesting. Because if 2 people sound the exact same, it's like, well, I feel like he's talking to a mirror. This isn't very fun. But these 2 contrast each other in the ways, in the words and the pacing and the body language, and then they complement each other in their cadence. So we've got that really nice, like, yeah, the conversation flows really well. I believe that these two people are friends. I believe that these two people are allies and talk to each other. And at the same time, it's very rich in the voices so that it sounds different together. So when we put that together to read, because I read these lines independently, let's read them together. It says, what's up with you? Jez says, nothing. Does it look like nothing? I'm fine. How long have we been friends? I shrug. Forever. Yeah, so I know when something's wrong. Nothing's wrong. I call bullshit. Call whatever you like. Right? Like, really great back and forth. I can hear both voices. It's like, yeah, I totally can envision this conversation happening because they complement each other. And then there's a nice contrast that gives a depth of emotion there. So that's something you're doing really well. Voices are spot on. Emotional flow is present, which is a big leap, right? Like, as writers, I feel like emotional flow is like a 2.0, 3.0 thing that we got to focus on. I can see you working it. So for a first draft, that's impressive. It usually takes me like a second or third draft to get my, like, what do I want people to feel in this? So it's clear that, like, we have the taxi cab driver in the car pointing out the problem. If he's sick, you're cleaning it up. This is the first beat, right? Right here is the first beat of your story.
Yeah.
We then get Jez and having his first aggressive encounter with Henry, right? Which ups the tension a little bit. So if we start low in tension with the taxi cab driver being like, your friend's gonna puke. As a reader, I'm like, I don't want to watch somebody puke. So I'm already kind of like low on the emotional flow scale. But then it starts to ratchet up a little bit in intensity. So you're pulling me in with the intensity. We then have a moment of reflection, which dips down a little bit, and movement is important in a piece. So we're coming down a little bit. You're making me feel something a little bit different and hinting that something else happened that was real intense that I don't know. We then come back with this moment, this second conversation that ups it a little bit more, right? Just leave it, will you? No, I won't. Find it. Where he's like picking at him Jez is picking at Henry for picking at his fingers, right? The like cuts on his fingers. Then we have Jez's like final like declaration where he gets out of the car. This is kind of the climax of the moment. And then we move down into Henry's, like the last couple minutes of Henry's drive, which at the moment is falling flat because it's a lot of reflection. And because the cab driver's voice needs a little bit of work. But if we pull the cab driver back in, it's going to like up again because it'll have that comedy and we'll actually end on a high note. And the final piece is Henry stumbling out of the car in this encounter with his dad, where Henry kind of like physically falls apart and has this encounter with his dad. So yeah, so we've got a really nice, again, it doesn't matter how, like if you were to graph this, it doesn't matter if you're taking it down, it doesn't matter if you're taking it up, it doesn't matter like what we're looking for is movement, right? Like, is the reader feeling something, and do I know the like emotional journey I'm taking them on? Are there turns emotionally? Is there movement emotionally? If it's just flat, right, we're gonna bore our reader. So this one's got the like mountain climbing to the climax, which is great. Or we may say like the descent because it does end badly. So it's kind of the descent we started sick, small fight, second fight, picking at fingers, and then maybe a little bit back up with a comedic moment with the cab driver, and then dropping down again if we were to reverse the graph. Again, direction doesn't matter. All that matters is that we see movement. So you've got a strong emotional flow going, enough so that we can look at it and be like, okay, now that we know what we're going for emotionally, that this is like a descent with a bump up maybe and then another drop. Now that we know what we're going for emotionally, how do we like capitalize on that? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And since you're in editing mode for the book, just an editing tip, when I'm editing a full book, those are the two questions that I ask myself before I start. One is like, okay, well, so there's three. There's like, okay, what's the, conflict, choices and consequence going on here? Like, what's the plot, whatever plot device you're using, am I hitting that? You are, right? Like we have it laid out at first, like you're putting it right out front. He looks sick. And then we're gonna have this conversation about why is he sick? What choices is he making to get better or stay sick? And then at the end, we see him fall apart. So you've got like the plot is strong. The next question I'm going to ask is about character voices, right? Like, who are my voices and how are they modulating, right? Like your voices are strong and they both get a little bit more intense in the second conversation than the first conversation. So we've got modulation, expressing emotional tone. It's great. The third question I'm going to ask is like, what am I looking for emotionally in this scene? And you're nailing that emotional stuff. So now we can get down and dirty. Okay, any questions about all of that I just threw?
Oh, that's all good.
Those are tough. Good. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the specifics. The first big problem we have in the scene is that you lose the cab driver. Again, big cast conversation, closed box. We don't need the cab driver in this conversation here, right? Where Jez and Henry are having their back and forth. It would be unrealistic and weird for them to have that.
Yeah.
We have this moment of reflection here, and then we have the second conversation where Jez starts picking at them again. Here is where we want the cab driver, right? So if you're thinking about it as like a song where you've got like, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. You want to think of your cab driver as like the chorus.
Yeah.
She's going to come back and it doesn't need to be a lot. It just needs to be something. And it's going to create a little bit bigger break here between their interactions and like give you that like clear beat in the story. So you do it here with the taxi itself, right? This is that second break. You do it here with the taxi itself. The taxi's headlights gleam off the road sign that says, "Welcome to Astoria Parvera, almost home, thank God." Right? Like, so you're giving us this break between scenes here. Let the cab driver say something, right? Put that like almost home in the cab driver's mind. Or like have the cab driver say something about the sign, right? Like have the cab driver read it out loud. It doesn't need to be a lot, but just making sure that we're not losing that third character in the big cast scene. Bringing that third character back is important because we don't, especially since you're going to bring her back at the end. She's not furniture. Sometimes people are furniture in a scene, right? Like they're just there. The people sat in the coffee house and sipped coffee. They're not characters, they're furniture, right? But the cab driver speaks, and when she speaks, she becomes a character. So you gave her a very distinct voice. You gave her an accent.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so you're giving this side character agency, and when you give her agency, now you need to bring her back because she's actually a participant in the scene. So that's the first thing I do is at the end of each of their exchanges, I would give her a little bit of a tension relieving line. I would not have them respond to her.
Yeah.
Right? Like they don't respond to her up here, right? Your friend looks sick. If he's sick, you're cleaning it up. He'll be fine. Oh, he does respond. He'll be fine. Will I though? So they do respond, but it's not much, right? Like, and I would keep it that way. I would keep it that like out. Now, so that's the first thing is we got to bring the cab driver back. Let's keep talking about her. We'll skip to the end of the piece and we'll keep talking about her. So you've got these really strong protagonist voices in Jez and Henry. And then you've got the taxi cab driver in this, like, she's Scottish. Let's look at the first place she talks. This is her introduction. Granny mocking me up there. There she is, Primrose. Your friend looks a wee bit greener on the gills, the taxi driver says in her thick Scottish burr while changing gear. If if he's sick, you're cleaning it up, right? So this is her introduction, and she's got an interesting voice, and she's like off topic. Does that make sense? She's like around the topic, but she's not in the topic like Jez and Henry are, right? Like, so she's kind of picking up on what's going on, but she's not fully picking up what's going on, which gives her, so when we talk about her words, cadence, pacing, and body language, she's driving, right? Which gives her some very specific body language. The accent falls under words. She's got a very specific language she's using. So all of a sudden you've like bumped her out to be different from the other two. What we need, and here she gives you 2 sentences, which pulls her cadence out from Henry and Jez, because they're just talking once. So already she's talking more. So because she's a side character, and we don't have to see her in conversation with Jez and Henry all the time, she does not need to compliment them. In fact, it's better if she's just all contrast, because she gives us something. When a reader sees a side character that's all contrast, they instinctually go, they don't say this, but this is how they feel, is like, oh, these characters are all different, right? Like, so if she sounds too much like Jez and Henry, they're like, oh, these characters are all the same. But if we can exploit our side characters to have these big voices that are super different from our main characters, then our readers go like, oh, these characters all sound different. And we can cheat a little bit with our main characters where they complement each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So when we get down here at the bottom, you've got her in this conversation with Henry where Jez has left the car. Yeah, here we go. Jez has left the car and she's decided she's going to give Henry advice, which is perfect for her voice because it's that like, you know, around the topic, not on the topic, but around the topic.
Yeah.
Cab drivers are great for this, by the way. There's so many, like we see it a lot in movies where cab drivers are great. These side characters are fantastic moments to recreate a scene. So when you're talking about your bigger novel, right, like in the scope of your whole novel, we want to show character transformation. And one of the ways we can show character transformation is by repeating scenes, right? Repeating circumstances, and then you show that the character acts differently in the first circumstance than the second circumstance. So, great example of this is in the movies Deadpool. We're talking about, right? There's a cab driver in Deadpool. He only shows up occasionally. His sole role is to give Deadpool someone to talk to about what's going on.
Yeah.
So that we can see Ryan Reynolds' character transformation from an uncompassionate a-hole to a empathetic a-hole, right? Like that's the character transformation that he goes through. So you've got a great opportunity here to bring her back, not a lot, but in key moments.
Yeah.
So like repeat her scene, especially since you said this is a series, across the series, so that when she shows up, it's time for Henry to have a moment of reflection, right? Now, what's great about the way you've designed her, and again, we'll just say it's intentional. What's great about the way you've designed her is that she's off topic, much like the cab driver in Deadpool, where he's actually usually talking about his own life, but we get to see, you know, Ryan Reynolds interact with somebody. So here, and so through the interaction, we get to see how Ryan Reynolds changes. Here, she's again talking about her own life, but we get to see Henry interact with her. And that's how we can see the emotional and voice change in Henry over the course of the novel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that all in mind, I want more from her here at the end. So we've got this like, she spends steering the wheel and glide around the corner. Tried it all, mindfulness, meditation, talking therapy, all bollocks. I'll leave my line out here in a second and I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
And then it's great because you've got Henry's voice in that, like he's not responding. I bow my head staring back at the passenger seat. Only got better when I admitted the problem, when I started standing up for myself, you know? I want to yell at her. I want to scream, what the hell do you know? Primrose stood up for herself. Look where it got her. I don't yell. Instead, I pick and pick and pick at the scar until my thumbnail comes away tinged red. The taxi driver is still speaking. Got a pal who owns a boxing gym in the city. Help me turn my life around. Please stop talking. The taxi driver crunches to a halt in the gravel driveway, and the driver says, twist the ring through your eyes. I could give you his number. Been there, done that. Suit yourself. That's $6.50. So that's the initial interaction, which is fun, but like just not big enough.
Yeah.
So right away with her, I want you to start just giving her more words. And the reason we're giving her more words is to separate her cadence in this dramatic way that the reader's going to notice, right? We've had Henry and Jess in this quick back and forth. So now we're going to put a talker with them, somebody who has a lot of words in a sentence. It doesn't mean she has to say more, right? Like she doesn't have to cover more material. She just needs to say the same thing over and over again, right? Like, so right away, I want like, oh, she spends the cereal great. Yeah, I don't read that well, so we'll skip that. Tried it all, mindfulness, meditation, talking therapy, all bollocks. And then I just want, none of it worked, not one thing.
Yeah.
Right, like just give her more words, right? Like, and then this really starts to pop. I bowed my head staring at the back of the passenger seat, right? Because she had 4 sentences here, and he's like,
yeah.
Only got better when I admitted the problem, when I started standing up for myself, you know? Now I'm okay with 2 sentences here because I'm gonna want to blow her out bigger down here. So we're like ramping up, right? Like we're building the like, oh, it's coming. And then he's like, I want to yell at her. But again, he doesn't say anything. He just picks his fingers. Got a pal who owns a boxing gym and helped me turn my life around. And then you've got this thing where you're like, please stop talking, please, was your original thing. And I just to build the emotions, I just want to slow it down just so we can feel it more. Please stop talking. Yeah, the gym's great. It's right on the corner, 4th and Mulberry. Have you ever been there? Right, like just have her like go up. It's fantastic. You know, and he does counseling while he boxes with you. Please just stop. And you know, it's really open anytime. You can go there whenever you want. Coffee shit though, right? Like, so just like have her like non-meaningless details, means nothing. Just like talking in 3 to 4 sentences at a time, just blowing it out. Please, God, stop.
That was great. I actually, when I read this, your suggestions on this, I was laughing my head off. It does expand the piece and just make it.
Yeah, it just lands this part of humor.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, especially in talking, going back to that emotional flow, right? Like we've got this heavy conversation between Jez and Henry, and he's picking at his fingers. So there clearly something tragic has happened, and I'm all in. I want to know what it was. I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's going to happen to their relationship. Skipping to the end of the piece, we have him like dying in front of his father. He's not dying, but he is like physically dying in front of his father. Yeah. So overall, like this is a heavy emotional thing. If we can give a moment of levity with a side character, it just deepens the richness of it. And so that's what I want here is I want her voice just blown up. Now, when we're editing, we might find a moment like this. We're like, oh, I'm going to really blow this character's voice up. We got to make sure we go back to the top of the piece and give her that voice all the way through. Right. So we got to come back up here and make sure she's got 2 sentences here. We may want to give her a 3rd one. She's got a dialect here that isn't quite popping at the end. So we want that like consistency of voice for her. So we may want to come back and make sure it pops at the end of the piece as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And this is where, for me, running some kind of chart, right? Like I use the ones that we use on the site, but because by the time I get to chapter 24 and I'm ready to bring her back, I'm going to have totally forgotten about her voice. So we need to like, I have to write it down. Some writers can just hold it in their head, but I have to write it down. So any questions about the cab driver or anything else you want to talk about with her?
No, I don't think so. I think you nailed that.
Awesome. Let's talk about Jez. There are moments in here where I really want you to give Jez more body language. Mostly because there's a couple ways we could read his voice here. Right? So I could read, what's up with you? Nothing. It doesn't look like nothing. I'm fine. How long have we been friends? Right? And I can put this like in my head, I can put this like friendly inflection to it, which is not what you're going for. right? So
Yeah.
right up here from the beginning, I'm going to drop his body language. Jez glares out the window and set his tone. So that if I can set his tone at the beginning of the piece, it'll carry through. So by adding this line, taking it from here, he'll be fine, she says, and putting it up here at the front, I now know how to hear Jez in my head, right? Because even here, if you're sick, if he's sick, you're cleaning it up, he'll be fine. At this point, I thought Jez was a girl, so ignore the she. He'll be fine, he responds. Jez glares, he'll be fine, Jez glares out the window, right? That he'll be fine, I read differently and had to come back to it a second time. So if I take this body language and I put it up front, you set the tone for Jez's voice, and now I can carry that tone all the way through. Because your dialogue's so strong and you don't need dialogue tags, we can start using them strategically to convey emotional change, right? So when I read something like this, I want to know, like, when is Jez starting to feel frustrated? When is Jez digging in? And when he's starting to feel frustrated and when he's starting to dig in, that's when I want to hit him with body language, right? To give us more emotional tone. What's up with you? Jez says, nothing. Doesn't look like nothing. I might give something there, but we're just slowly building, right? Like, so I may just keep it there. I'm fine. How long have we been friends? Right? Maybe there, we're still building. I shrug, forever. Yeah. So I know when something's wrong. I might have him look at Henry here.
Yeah.
Right. And I put it at the end because you have I shrug forever here. I don't want to give him body language up front because we're losing the like rhythm of the piece if we start putting all the body language up front. So I'm going to put it on. Actually, I may put it up front because I want to convey the tone before I get to the sentence. It's a mixed bag. I shrug forever. Jez looked over at me. Just look from the window to me. Yeah, so I know when something's wrong. You may put it in the middle. Yeah, Jez turned to look at me. So I know when something's wrong.
Yeah,
that's where I put it. That's where I put it. Yeah, Jez turned to look at me. So I know when something's wrong because it builds the like climax of the I know when something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's wrong. I call bullshit, Jez said. And like, is he staring at him? Is he looking back out the window? Like, is he engaging further or pulling away? Like, how do you feel, Jez? And so this is where I would definitely drop some body language.
Yeah.
Right? Just to give us that, like, again, like building the emotion of that thing. It doesn't need to be big. Just a couple words of like what he does. Is he playing with the door handle, right? Like fidgeting with the door handle conveys that he's uncomfortable. So like what dialogue for Jez is going to convey how he feels? And just drop that in here to give us that sense of like, yeah, or like, you know, does he push his leg, right? Like, which is like a friendly, like I call bullshit. Like, you know, which way do you want this to go? Drop that body language in here to land it home, right? I looked out the window, call whatever you like, right? To show that like disengagement.
Yeah.
And again, here, there's an emotional change. Jez is now going to get pissed. And we want to put that emotional change up front so that we know when I read say that again, that it's an expression of what's going on. So Jez sets his jaw, say that again, right? As opposed to say that again, Jez sets his jaw.
Yeah, it completely changes the tone.
Totally. By putting that like physicality up front, we get the like tone of this, of the words, and we're empowering our reader to imagine the scene, right? You have this note here, it's being lied to. If he's angry about being lied to, he needs to get angry up here.
Okay.
Right? The Jez sets his jaw needs to come at I call bullshit. Jez sets his jaw, I call bullshit. If there's one thing you say, it's being lied to. Call whatever you like. Say that again. Right? Now, this is a big challenge. And you give Henry his moment of reflection here, but it doesn't really land the emotion of the moment. He kind of needs to respond to say that again. So I would probably go, say that again. Just leave it, will you? I plead. I don't want to look him in the eye, so I don't, right? Like, and pull this dialogue piece up here to like complete the moment. And then we can come back to, no, I won't. Fine. then don't, I sigh. But you see how like reading it a second time, like I would never get this on my first draft, but coming back into my second draft and reading this a second time and being like, okay, how well am I communicating the emotional tone of this piece to the reader? How well can the reader really feel what's going on? And by strategically, because your voices are so strong, you empower yourself to start strategically using these dialogue tags to really nail the emotion of this in like, you know, that Ernest Hemingway type way, where like just by moving dialogue tags around and like when somebody takes a drink, like in Hemingway, everybody's always drinking, when somebody takes a drink, when somebody looks off into space, when somebody like, you know, touches somebody else, right? Like those small, like 4-word sentences become really powerful in conveying the emotion of where you're going. It's a tough, for me, this is where writing becomes really hard, because we agonize so much over getting the first draft done that when we get to the editing, it's like, I just really want to fix the grammar and go about my day.
Yeah.
And this is where it becomes like, the question is like, am I, and there's no wrong answer here before I even ask the question, just to be clear. Am I writing something that I want people to revel over? Or am I writing something that I want them to move on to the next book? Right? Like, and it's an honest and real question. And, you know, if you're writing, I'm not going to say romance because everybody always picks on romance. If you're writing an urban fantasy that's intended to be a 25-book series, and you want somebody to crunch it out in a night and not necessarily like, you know, love these characters, then this level of obsession over tone and editing, I don't know if that's what you want to do, because it's going to slow you down. You're going to have to do like 3 or 4 drafts of this thing. If you're writing a book where you're like, no, I want a, you know, sticking with the fantasy theme, I want a, oh crap, the name of it just slipped my mind. Dragons and things. And he's like, thank you. Yeah, I want a Game of Thrones, J.R.R. Martin level thing, then yeah, you're going to do 4 drafts of this, and you're going to a paragraph of dialogue like this where you're like, oh, there's not many words there, how much do I need to obsess over it? Twice as much. Yeah, right, because the words have to be used super strategically. So all of that just depends on what kind of book you want to make.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for me, I like getting deep into the edits. Like the first draft's okay, but I'm not, it's probably my least enjoyable part. And I know a lot of people say they hate editing, but yeah, you can't edit a blank page. So yeah, totally. And just to be clear, again, like there's no wrong answer, because I know as some writers tend to bend to the like, well, why would you not do 4 drafts? Like this is your work of art. This is your, but my first 4 books, I did 1 draft and I sent it to Laura to edit. And part of that for me was like, writing is very difficult emotionally for me. I'm putting a lot of like my personal experiences into the page. And so I just needed to, like, it was more like therapy. It's like, I just need to do it and get it out. I look back at those books and I'm like, they're not as good as they could be. At the same time, that's not why I was writing them. So like, you know, there's no shame in that, and being like, I'm gonna like, that is what I wanted to produce at the time. I was getting my career going. I was putting books out. I just wanted to get words into the world and see if this like storytelling was something I could actually do. Right. Like, so, and I didn't expect people, I wanted people to read them and be like, that was fun, and then go on to the next one. Right. The book I'm writing now, I'm looking at it, I'm like, I'm gonna have to do like 7 edits of this thing, because I actually have an experience I want them to like sit through. So it's a little like cooking. Like, you know, I got 5 kids. So I cook all of our dinners. So every night, every night it's like, hey, well, you know, you and your, if you're married, or if you have a partner, you and your partner in like establish rules. My wife and I have been married for 20 years. This is our 20-year anniversary. And we real quickly
established that like cooking stresses Wendy out. Wendy doesn't like, if she has to cook at night, she gets angry, and we end up eating a lot of hot dogs and mac and cheese. But cooking is like therapeutic for me. So when I cook, it gets fun and it's a little healthier, and like I actually spend time figuring things out. So, and I like to experiment with new recipes. So we're trying new stuff all the time, which is a, you know, pro and con. Because sometimes it's not edible, but yeah, you at least get the experience. So I took over the cooking real quick. But sometimes when I cook, I'm just looking to like fire something off.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes when I cook, I'm looking to like make an experience for my kids. And like, you know, I made ramen for the homemade ramen for the first time.
I saw it on Instagram. It was very
thanks.
It looked good.
It looked good. Pretty. Didn't pay off in taste, but it looked good. Yeah. Then I took a great picture. So needed like twice the spices. But all that to say, you know, that was an experience. Like I'm putting together multiple things that I'm like, so that would be like a book that I've edited like 5 times. I can't do that every night. Sometimes I just need to like roll something out. But it's the same. So there's no shame. Both serve a purpose. You just got to pick what style you're going to pick. Okay. So we've talked about body language and how we're using it. We've talked about the side character and blowing her voice out. You have italics here. This guy.
I think that was just a mistake.
Okay.
They're not supposed to be there.
It doesn't have to be a mistake, even though I hate italics. It doesn't have to be a mistake. It just needs to be consistent.
Yeah.
So you use it here to quote somebody in his head, like, or to like, what does he want me to say? This guy killed this girl waving his finger in the air. It's a nice device, actually. It's a good use of italics because you're not saying it out loud. It's just in his head. But then when you come down here and you do the same thing with the cab driver, where he's like, I just want to scream, blah, 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 blah. You don't put that in italics. So you either have to, every time he's going to think something like, oh, here we go. What the hell do you know? Right? With this device, that should also be in italics because it's dialogue internally that he's not saying out loud.
Yeah.
If you were to use italics in this piece, I would actually be like, yeah, that's a good use of italics because you're not doing it all the time. Right? Like we're not filling the page with italics. And you're in first person. So you're using it for a very strategic way, which is like, it's not everything he thinks, right? I want to yell at her. I want to scream. Primrose stood up for herself. Look at where that got her. You're not putting this whole paragraph in italics, which would drive me crazy. And I would have marked up your whole thing where you are, but you're just taking like, these are verbal expressions internally, putting those in italics, set them apart from his actual inner monologue. So that's not a bad thing to do. It could actually enhance the writing if this is something his voice does a lot. So you might want to think about it because after you've done it for a couple chapters in a conversation, you could actually force it in here, right? Like he nods at my scar, leave it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, but like I force my hands to relax and lace together and squeeze them hard. And you may actually have to say like, leave it alone, Jez. I want to say. I force my hands together. Right? Like, so if this is a device you're going to use, you can start actually using it as a tool in the middle of conversations to like play out that like how it's working, but it's got to be sparing. Because italics, it gives the reader, italics give the reader a lot to process. It's one of those like devices. It's like a semicolon. Like nobody, like everybody hears a semicolon differently. So when it's a great tool, especially if you're creating a character voice that has run-on sentences.
Yeah,
a semicolon's a fantastic tool, but everybody's going to hear it a little bit differently because we don't use it that often. So you just got to be you got to be strategic in how you're using it.
I think I might sprinkle some in at the key plot moments because he does have that dichotomy in his personality where obviously, like I said at the start, he's a trained martial artist, but this flaw that he has prevents him from always saying what he thinks or jumping into the action until later on in the book, obviously.
I like that a lot. Okay, talk to me about what you're going with for the ending. my preaching teacher used to say when I was in seminary, he used to say, there's two things that are critical for a sermon. You gotta hook them in the opening, and you gotta stick the landing.
Yeah.
And you don't stick the landing. So talk to me about what's going on here with the dad emotionally. There's no right or wrong answer. Just what do you see?
The way it's hard because you've only got one scene, but the way I've set his parents up is that his dad is kind of the more laid back of the two, and his mum is ultra fiery.
Gotcha.
So I'm trying to set up that juxtaposition between those two characters, but obviously without the mum being there, it's hard to see, I guess.
No, yeah, and I get where you're going. That the dad is like unimpressed that his kid is dying when he gets up. Yeah. Okay, so we need the dad to say that, because you've got, and part of what's hurting you is your descriptions of his pain are so good that I'm like, oh my gosh, this dude is dying, and then the dad's like blah blah blah. It's like, okay, what's happening? So we need the dad to, like, there's an emotional tug of war going on there that is great to have, but we need to emphasize it to make it clear to the reader, like, this is what's happening. So I'm just going to read this paragraph because it's fantastic, and because I think people think that I hate prose. I actually love prose when it's done well and sparingly. I feel like I'm submerged in water. Someone squeezes my head in a vice, and my breath so shallow, my heart rate spikes, beating so fast it almost hums. Everything lurches, and I stagger sideways. My hands slam into the walls, and pain prickles my palms. My stomach folds in on itself. I gag once, twice, vomiting, gushing between my lips, and smattering the flower beds. The air is thick with the sour stench of bile and the perfumed floral scent of roses, a combination that makes my stomach roil even more. Damn, man, come on. And then you have this all in one paragraph. I'm going to space it out because I want to start slowing down here, right? You just assaulted me with this fantastic description, and now I want to slow it down a little bit. A wild animal bellowing shatters the silence, a low rumble wail, right? What is that? And then I realize I'm the one making the noise. I scream and I scream and I scream. A loud click followed by an even louder creak, the front door opening. Rushing footsteps crunch along the gravel. Henry, oh Jesus, right? Here's where I need the dad to actually, if you want the dad that is not moved by I scream and scream and scream, we need the dad to comment on it.
Yeah.
Right? Oh Jesus doesn't work, right? Like, Henry, get your ass up out of my flower bed. Why are you wailing? Like, come on now. Dad, I tilt my head up to meet the gauge. Well, you're in a right state, right? I'd appreciate it if next time you came to the house, you at least got to the bathroom before you decided to vomit all over him.
Yeah.
Right? Like that, like pushing it back. And at the same time, you want to give him, I scrubbed the back of my hand across my mouth and straighten quick, think of an excuse to lie. I overdid it a bit. Dad places his hand on my shoulder. So I would probably, again, like, in order to convey the like compassionate but at the same time unmoved thing you're going for, I'd move this up top, right? So a loud click followed by a louder creak, the front door opening, rushing footsteps. He's not going to rush. Footsteps crunch across the gravel. I feel my dad's hand on my shoulder. Henry, dear God, what are you doing to my flowers? Right? Like that kind of like like physical concern matched with verbal distance, which is that like typical what we do for a father that we want, like, or any parent that's like emotionally distant and like emotionally struggling, is we give them physical concern with pulled back vocabulary. If they have pulled back concern, pulled back physicalness, and pulled back vocabulary, they end up being a dysfunctional and distant parent, right? But what you described was one that's actually like cares, but it doesn't quite know how to engage. So have them engage physically, but not verbally, right? Like this isn't the dad. This is the dad that will like when you're sad, will reach across the table and grab your hand, but will not say it's okay and I love you.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Which is the emotionally engaged parent, where like the emotionally engaged parent is going to grab your hand and be like, hey, it's going to be okay. The other parent's going to like grab your hand and rub it a little bit and then be like, can I get you some tea? Right? Like, it's not like, you know, so we need that here to, because, and again, this is your own fault because the first of the piece is so good. You got to stick the ending just as well.
Yes.
So we got to land the ending just as well. And then you've got this dad. Yes, I want to tell him everything, but how can I tell him? He'll think I'm crazy. Nothing. I need him to say something.
Yeah.
We got to give him the finish, partially because part of Henry's pacing is that he never finishes any of these conversations, right? Jez finishes the conversation. The taxi cab driver finishes the conversation. Henry can't be the last one to speak at the end of a chapter unless you want it to be this big dramatic declaration he makes when he's like finally going to rally and do whatever it is that he has to do. Then he can end the chapter and speak because it's going to feel momentous to the reader. But we want the dad to have the last word here because Henry never has the last word in his pacing. Okay, so redo the ending. Last thing I want to tell you. I don't know what your chapter 1 and chapter 2 are. This is a hell of a chapter 1. You have it marked as chapter 3.
Yes. This
is a hell of a chapter 1. I got into this and I was like, oh, I'm reading this book. Right? This is a great start, especially in a thriller where you want to hook the reader up front and the reader is going to be unimpressed by your monsters. So like, because urban fantasy readers read a lot of monsters. Yeah. So the monsters aren't going to set you apart. Right? It's like the horror readers aren't going to be impressed by your horror. They're not going to be, what they're going to be impressed by is how you're playing with the genre. So they expect monsters, they expect action scenes. If you set them up with a scene like this, where he's clearly separate, and then you flash back to whatever your chapter 1 and chapter 2 are, that's going to stick the opening of your book.
Well, you just blew my mind then, I think. Okay. I would recommend, and again, I haven't read your chapter 1 and chapter 2. If they're as good as this chapter, you can keep them up there, but man, this is a good freaking chapter. Thank you.
And I would, start strong because you'll pull us in. Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to talk about with the piece?
No, I think that covers it. That's been really good.
Awesome. Very cool. Okay. I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording, and you and I can chat a little bit more. Thanks for coming on, by the way.
No worries.